1 p.m, 1st of July 1982. 2nd Platoon of Bravo Troop enters the area of operations and rushes to the east of Kriegsburg village under airburst artillery. To the east and southeast, forward positions start to report a smoke screen, and combat support troops at Kriegsburg depot are scrambled to defensive positions. Second Platoon is to form up for tasking at a central holding position, but short of reaching this point, its tanks are diverted to intercept Soviets heading south. Before the Soviets hit Charlie Company's positions, there'll be a brief window of opportunity to engage them. Around the same time that Alpha Company's forward platoon is preparing for an ambush, Bravo Troop spots the Soviets breaking the wood edge and engages. The engagement is fierce and one-sided. All but a handful of vehicles are knocked out before cresting the hill onto Charlie Company's positions. To the north, however, Alpha Company's ambush platoon is now facing a much larger armoured force. This is likely the main forward security element, if not the main avenue of attack. As Alpha Company's positions falter, 2nd Platoon Bravo Troop moves to Kriegsburg to meet the Soviets head-on, and the newly arrived 1st Platoon prepares to flank through the woods. The engagement we've just watched is an attempt to apply Airland Battle tactics from the 1982 edition of Field Manual 100-5 Operations. But before looking at the tactics applied, I'd like to look at the roots of the Field Manual and its reason for being. Operations has its origins in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. Though not the sole foundation upon which the doctrine was built, the war certainly provided NATO and the United States with a shock to realise they may not be ready for a peer-to-peer conflict in Europe. Data from the war showed that the Soviet equipment was as capable or better than NATO equipment, and in Europe the Soviets had it in significant mass. It also showed how exceptionally violent and quick modern warfare would be, with massive losses of equipment in a short period of time. The traditional Cold War threat of massive retaliation, which relied on nuclear weapons to deter a Soviet attack, was no longer seen as sufficient alone. The commander normally associated with identifying the need to reorient, and the first commander of the institution specifically created to do so was General William E. Depew. As commander of the Training and Doctrine Command, or TRADOC, General Depew fundamentally transformed the army and led the creation of a strategy that broke with the army's offensive tradition. Germany offered little depth in which to conduct mobile operations, with the West Germans favouring a forward defence away from the industrial heartland and population centres just a few miles from the border. As a result, the military-political compromise was to conduct a highly mobile or active defence in a compressed band of terrain 20 to 40 kilometres from the border. This active defence focused commanders on winning the first battle of the next war through attritional warfare focused on weapon systems. Depew's doctrine was unsuccessful in war games, but its failure had paved the way for a renewed commitment to Europe after the Vietnam War. So when he retired in 1977, his successor, General Donné Starry, was left to rethink a new one. General Donné Starry's work resulted in the 1982 edition of Operations, which introduced the concept of Airland Battle. The 1976 version of Operations stated that the defender has every advantage but one: he does not have the initiative. Airland Battle sought to change this by taking the offensive and seizing the initiative through offensive manoeuvre rather than firepower. It was a combined arms doctrine that emphasised the use of air power and ground forces to attack the enemy through the depth of the battle space. Where active defence had fought to a tie, Airland Battle fought to win. Commanders must consider the enemy's perspective when planning, thinking like their opponent in order to defeat them. Having already been in his shoes, I have some idea how to achieve this. The Soviet force uses predictable timings with its echelon approach, which I should attempt to disrupt, upsetting his timetable. I want to make it difficult for him to mass force, and want to make it difficult to manoeuvre, to invoke the spirit of Agincourt in Airland Battle. Agincourt was a significant English victory in the 100 Years' War. Tired, hungry, outnumbered and sick, the English defeated the French using a combination of factors. The English used terrain, a narrow field which was surrounded by marshes, to their advantage, deploying forces in a way that maximised their effectiveness and constricted French numbers. As the Soviets, I'd spent most of my time in pre-battle march formation. The battlefield is broken into three by thick wood blocks, each the tactical responsibility of an understrength company playing as the Americans. These three sectors bottleneck at various points, making it difficult to squeeze Soviet company-sized blocks through. They're also difficult to control or maintain formation over. On my northern approach, there were two wood blocks to corner. Both of these points appeared to be risky and vulnerable, but an attacker would need to take them in order to break out to the preferred attack formation on the open fields north of Kriegsburg. Whilst my plan was starting to focus on narrowing that gap in numbers using terrain, unlike Agincourt, I'd have to split my forces between static and mobile. The static forces, or light infantry, would hold terrain, prioritising firepower over their lesser mobility, and the dynamic forces, or cavalry, would focus on the offensive, prioritising manoeuvre over firepower. Once they're in the attack formation, the Soviets could bring a monumental firepower advantage to bear, so the dynamic element would manoeuvre to avoid strength and strike weakness. The opening move of the battle was to withdraw Alpha Company's lead platoon to a new position, where it could ambush the flanks of any force that pushed through the northern route. The cavalry squadron was also moved to a more central position. The reason for this was to take advantage of my internal lines. The Soviets would have extended lines, which take longer to transport their forces across. I, on the other hand, would have shorter lines. This meant that my static infantry could act as tripwires, giving me time to anticipate their movements and move to intercept them at a point of my advantage. So the first example was the combat recon patrol heading south. This was flanked twice by 2nd Platoon Bravo Troop, once before reaching Charlie Company, and again after it had bypassed them. The next was the larger forward security element, or main body to the north. This was again hit twice by the newly arrived 1st Platoon Bravo Troop, just after the first wood block, then again between this block and the next, after 2nd Platoon had deployed in Kriegsburg, allowing 1st Platoon to withdraw and flank through the woods. The last was when a large tank force was heard rumbling through the centre. This put 2nd Platoon in Kriegsburg at serious risk of being flanked. 1st Platoon was moved to a berm line and intercepted this force, demonstrating some of the lower level tactics employed throughout the battle. 1st Platoon used berm drills to pop up, fire and reverse out of view, A similar approach was used at corners and keyholes through Kriegsburg. I was very lucky here, and replaying the same turn with tiny alterations to timings and positions showed very different results. Whilst all this was happening, artillery and air support was harassing the Soviets both at and behind the front lines. Generally, the Americans had reduced the Soviets' willingness to fight by causing confusion or disorientation through unexpected manoeuvres or the use of surprise. Fortunately, the Airland Battle doctrine never needed to see use in Europe, but the Gulf War demonstrated its effectiveness, drawing parallels to the German Blitzkrieg. This is where I'll pick up in the next video, looking at the Bundeswehr, Germany's post-war army, its influences on NATO tactics, and the period of imbalance that followed the Cold War, and shrinking armies of higher quality fought against lesser quality regime forces and insurgents.